Finally, maybe I shouldn't have waited all this time for to talk about this big topic because my throat feels tired. But I played Alan Wake, another game I was meaning to get around to for a while. I got this and Alan Wake's American Nightmare on sale for pretty cheap. I figured, why not? And you know what? Okay, this is a game that I've heard about. It's had, I think, a bit of a limited reach just because it was an Xbox 360 exclusive for quite a while. But I believe back in 2020, it went to Steam. And then there was Control, there was Alan Wake 2. So it's kind of come back into the public consciousness a little bit. And I wanted to, hey, you know, it's probably pretty short. So let's check it out. I really like Alan Wake. Alan Wake is a very cool game. I think it has a couple shortcomings, but for the most part, I really enjoyed my time with it. Alan Wake is about an author, Alan Wake, who visits he's vacationing with his wife in this little seaside harbor town in Washington State. He's like this horror mystery thriller author, and he's had writer's block for the past 2 years since the completion of his last book. And he is the sort of purpose of the trip is to clear his mind, get him back on track, get his mind off of work. So they go to a cabin that they've rented, which is out on this lake. It's in the middle. It's on this island in the middle of a lake that you got to take a bridge out to. And everything's cool. But the first night, his wife, Alice, surprises him with a typewriter. And they get into a fight because he's like, I didn't want to deal with this shit. I was trying to de-stress and not think about writing. They get into an argument. And some weird shit happens. Alice falls into a lake. Lots of missing memories. Don't know what the fuck happened. There's a weird lady in funeral attire. Some old lady in funeral garb who is flickering in and out of existence. Suddenly, Alan wakes. That's the other thing. His initial is A-wake. He's awake. Alan awakes in his car, smashed into the side of hanging over a cliffside, smashed practically through the barricade. Stumbles out. He discovers it's been a week, and he just cannot recall what happened. So all of a sudden, he starts to be assaulted by these sort of shadowy zombies that he must defend himself by shining a light on them. Lots of light and shadow. That's like a core motif throughout the game. And just figuring out what the fuck happened in that time and what is going on. Because it seems like he starts picking up these pages of a manuscript. And the manuscript seems to predict stuff that's going to happen in the future. And these aren't just little non-diegetic collectibles. They are meant to be real, and he's picking them up and reading them. And the story just kind of goes from there. He's trying to get his wife back. He's trying to figure out what's going on. Conflict arises. So, when I talk about the game, I think it's mostly about the story. The game is really mostly about the narrative, specifically the writing. It's a very mechanically lean game. There's not a whole lot going on. The gameplay primarily consists of running through the woods. The combat is essentially the shadowy zombies who have been overtaken by this dark presence. If you shine your flashlight on them for long enough, a little reticle will close all the way. The shadow will be blasted off of them, and then they will you can actually damage them. So with your guns. So there is a very light amount of resource management, between your ammo, the batteries that you need to power your flashlight. The flashlight is itself, it does not run out of battery, but if you choose to kind of put it on the high beam setting, which will affect enemies faster, then it will drain. It will actually start draining. You can quick reload your battery with batteries. So it's this kind of game of, there are prerequisites before you can actually attack the enemies. You have to wear down these shadowy defenses, which requires you to keep some distance, keep the light on them. So the enemies always have some amount of time where they are dangerous. Eventually, you are able to figure out, kind of like, there's a lot of situations where I was able to like bottleneck them into a position and then just dispatch them without care. But occasionally the game does toss you into very stressful, difficult situations that are legitimately pretty tricky to get yourself out of. Just throwing many enemies into a large open field, or a larger area with a lot of blind spots for them to route you from. So that stuff does come up. I'd say that there is the primary purpose of combat in a horror game, in the way that it serves the overall game, is that it creates a sense of danger and a sense of an accountability for the player. That no, you can't just run from this stuff. You actually have to deal with it, and you need to confront the scary things. I think that as a horror game, it's pretty scary. There are some legitimately spooky, atmospheric moments. The combat isn't always that freaky, but there are points where I felt like, oh man, I don't know. Okay, one moment that made a big impression on me is really early in the game. It's like episode 1 or 2. It follows an episodic structure. You go into a cabin. You're just trying to go from point A to point B. And on the way, you can go into a little cabin on the side of the road. And inside there's some supplies. It's not really in use, but there's some supplies you can scavenge and a radio that you can turn on. There's a number of radio broadcasts that you can listen to throughout the game. And as I'm just sitting listening to this radio broadcast, it's still daytime in game outside. It's still daytime. And they only throw enemies at you at night. So I'm listening. So I feel like fairly safe. I'm just laying in this slightly eerie cabin. It's an abandoned cabin. It's always got a kind of a mood to it. And as I'm just listening to this radio broadcast, waiting for it to be done, I notice something out of the corner of my eye from the side of the screen. And I turn the camera to a window and I see just a split second of a shadowy figure walking past holding an axe. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. And that freaked me out. That genuinely freaked me out because I was not expecting it. And I left the cabin fully expecting that the game had just spawned an enemy and that they were trying to get into the cabin and the pathing had just screwed up. And I go out and there's nothing. There's no enemy there. There's nothing to attack you. The game doesn't even start spawning enemies until you get to a much later point in the, for a while. You are not in a combat. It doesn't expect combat from you. It's just this thing that happens, and I don't know if it was intentional. It feels intentional. That's right. Like there's kind of a balance to be had with scripted horror stuff in games, because sometimes to me, if it feels too scripted, it loses a bit of the fear. It loses a bit of effectiveness. Because I and this could just be that I play a lot of video games, but it's a situation where I see the seams, I'm seeing the strings on the puppet, and I'm seeing how, okay, when I walk over that spot, that thing jumps out. Okay, I'm understanding how it works. But that moment, it felt so organic, and like I could have just missed it. I could have just missed it if I hadn't even been, if I had been looking away or closing my eyes to rest them or whatever, if I had just been looking in a different direction and not caught that, maybe I just wouldn't have seen that little moment. And that was freaky to me. It was freaky because it felt like almost like there were no rules. There were no rules that I could follow. Or it broke the rules that I would get used to, I feel like a lot of people, if you've played a lot of games or horror games especially, sometimes you enter, you build up expectations for the game. In Quake 4, this is a weird example. In Quake 4, you get very used to anticipating when the enemies are going to pop out because that game is practically a rail shooter. I remember reading watching a video where someone mentioned, it was called like Spaces Designed for Violence. It was actually a whole thing about schools that were built in such a way to anticipate school shootings and the psychological effect that has on children to be in an environment built like that. But in the intro to the video, he uses the example of video games and namely Gears of War, where Gears of War, it's a cover shooter. Every combat location needs to have some cover. So eventually, without even really realizing it, he just got used to walking into an area, and even if there was seemingly nothing going on, if he saw a bunch of waist-high walls, he was like, he started to subconsciously expect a combat encounter to break out. So it was rarely a surprise after a certain point. And again, when you break that rule is, I don't know, you tap into something. That's the one example that I can think of in the game that really got me, but it was so memorable. It reminds me of, I want to say it was Yoko Taro who said this, but don't exactly quote me on this. But I believe it was a Japanese designer who said that giving the player a sense of freedom is not about presenting them with 100 options. You could give the player an immense sense of freedom by having 5 options, but only presenting 2 or 3, or even 1. Because when the player feels like they understand the rules and they understand what's possible, suddenly, when they accidentally, because I'm sure many devs will set up situations to kind of teach this to players, when they accidentally discover method 4, or something like that, at that moment they're like, whoa, what? Hang on, I can do what? And that feeling is so much more powerful. The feeling of discovering something is so much more powerful, makes so much more of an impression in your mind that you don't have to have infinite possibilities, You can just supply the player with enough and then let them explore it. And the feeling of exploration is more rewarding to them. Not a one-to-one example of what I'm talking about, but I think that letting the player stumble across things organically creates these really memorable moments. The improvised stuff. The improvised and the quote-unquote improvised. Because again, maybe that was scripted. I don't know. But it was cool. I really like the characters in the game. I think, okay, so I'm talking about presentation. That's most of what I have to say for the gameplay. It does a good job. It does what it needs to. And it never really felt like it dragged. There was like 1 or 2 spots that I was like, ugh, this sucks. When they start when the darkness starts throwing objects at you and it starts getting physics-based, was when it was, there's like one or two spots that are like, this is fucking annoying, that I had to redo like 5 or 6 times. For the most part, the gameplay is serviceable to pretty fun, depending on how much you like it. It's not incredibly deep, but also the game is like 10 hours. So I think it took me 12 hours total. It's not very long. Presentation-wise, I think Alan Wake is a really interesting case study in being of its time. I think in some ways it's aged very well, and in other ways it has not aged very well. I guess in one funny way that it's aged, this is a 7th gen game, so it's got collectibles! It's got collectibles, baby! And you know, one of those makes sense. The manuscript, the pages of the manuscript, that makes sense, you know? That is actually worked into the story as an important thing. But they're also just like, yeah, there's like 100 coffee thermoses strewn about the town of Bright Falls. Just randomly in the woods, too. Just, I guess someone was drinking coffee and just left it here. I don't know what that was all about, but yeah. So, I think the ways in which the game has aged very well are, it's got a really good story. The writing is very tight. I fucked up my sleep schedule a little bit just so that I could stay up to finish the game because I was so interested in what was going to happen. Especially once you get through like the first episode or two and you start really getting into, I don't know, like every episode feels like it's paced very well. They frequently have these great set piece moments. Oh my God, the one in episode 4 with the stage. If you played the game, you know what I'm talking about. That one rules. That one kicks so much ass. And just, I don't know, just interesting plot developments continue to happen, especially like in the latter half. Like episodes 3 to the end. 3 through 6. The characters I find really likable. Alan Wake he's kind of an everyman, you know? He's obviously, this is very Stephen King inspired as he feels like a Stephen King character. He is a writer. His name is, he's like kind of a self-insert. He's a bit of a self-insert for Sam Lake, the lead writer, creative guy at Remedy. Sam Lake can get away with having self-inserts because Remedy's games are generally very good. So they can get away with it. He's a cool character. He has, you kind of have to, you have to get a bit of a handle on him. He's got a bit of a negative, kind of darker side. People keep talking about his temper, but at the same time, he's not the most stable guy. He's not the most stable guy, and that kind of manifests itself positively and negatively. So people keep talking about his temper. Apparently he like punched a paparazzi, which honestly, not going to really put that past him. I'm not gonna hold that against him. I mean, but also like yeah, he gets in fights with his wife. As far as I know, they never mention anything about getting physical. But he's there's like a moment in the manuscript where a character notes that Alan is like almost scarily in love with his wife. Like, he's an intense guy. He has an intense emotional side to him. And I think that part of it's almost like part of the theme of the game, or it is that these things that he writes in the manuscript start coming to life. These events he writes about start happening. And it's almost like he can't, part of the author, the author puts a part of themselves into their creation, but the creation then almost feeds back. It feeds back into the real world. I don't know. It's cool. He's a cool horror protagonist as a writer. He's also I went and watched a bunch of interviews with Sam Lake. One of his goals was to differentiate Alan from Max Payne. And one of the ways they did that was to make Alan feel very unprepared for the situation. I mean, there's no crosshair in the game. There is kind of like, it's like, okay, yeah, he's able to handle firearms, which is like, I don't know how many people would be able to just pick up a gun and know how to use it or reload it or anything. So a little bit of fantasy, but you do feel a sense of unpreparedness. Every time you start off in a sprint, he has this weird uncoordinated takeoff animation where he almost like flails, trying to, almost panicked, taking off. He runs out of breath after like 5 seconds, which is another like component of the combat. Is it's kind of hard to run away from enemies. Spooky. He feels like he's unprepared for the situation, and he's just trying to figure out. He's just freestyling his way through this whole thing. His editor Barry comes into the story, and at first I thought Barry. I didn't realize he was going to be such a major character, and I kind of expected him that he's like a slime ball. He's kind of like a slimy editor agent. And he's trying to, oh, Al, you doing your work? He's always putting pressure on Alan to work. He and Alice don't really get along. And I don't know, that's kind of where I thought it was going. By the end of the game, I was like, dude, if anything happens to Barry, I'm going to be so pissed off. If they hurt my man, Barry Wheeler, I'm going to be pissed off. He's just like I don't know. He's just a funny guy. He's like a jovial, he's got a big personality, right? He's a big guy with a big personality. And he's not really like a creep. They make a point that he's not creepy. He gets the hots for women, but he doesn't do anything like over the line. He's just kind of like what the kind of guy. Al, what the fuck is going on over here? What this is crazy. I love Barry so much. There's like this description in one of the manuscripts of a moment that you never get to see, but it's Barry when he gets separated from Alan, and he's in a store with a bunch of camping equipment and like lanterns and flashlights and stuff. And the description of him smiling because he's finally gonna get to feel like an action hero suiting up is so awesome. He's like, yeah, I love Barry so much. In all of those ways, right? Like they really nailed it with the narrative. The writing is good. The dialogue is good. The progression of the plot and the pacing, I think for the most part, is really spot on. The performances are all great. Pretty much every voice actor does a really good job in this game. The vocal direction is totally on point for practically everyone. The one place this game is let down is visually. This game visually has not aged very well. I don't know how it looked at the time, but you really feel that this is before the big leaps in facial capture, especially. Excuse me, facial capture and motion capture. Every character has this very stiff expression the whole time. It's really the eyes. You know, like the eyes? That's a big thing. I felt that when I was going through Arkham. Specifically Arkham Asylum. Where that game's, I was like, this game looks really nice. It's got a great art direction. The textures are obviously kind of early HD era, but it doesn't matter because the way everything... Yeah, the art direction is so good. that everything totally comes together. And then you talk to an NPC and it cuts to a flat as a board medium shot of Batman, and it looks 10 times worse. The game's visuals just fall off a cliff. It's crazy. Alan Wake never gets quite that bad. It's just sort of a consistent kind of, these characters are they're in these intense, extreme situations. The performances are really involved and emotional, and their eyes just cannot move. Their brows don't move at all. They're all just stiff. Like I already used like a board. Stiff as a corpse. The motion capture feels, how motion capture often has a kind of, I don't know, how would I describe it? Motion capture often has a bit of clunk to it. Even really high quality stuff. Maybe not for movies, but in games especially, you'll get, there's kind of a, I don't know how I'd say it, either a lightness to the way that characters move. It could be a lack of certain articulation. It could be the way that clothes don't fold properly as they move. Something about it, there's just kind of a, I don't know. I don't know what the term is for it. But it's like there's a bit of a clunk, a bit of a inaccuracy in the motion capture. Even in really good stuff, I find, in games. For movies, maybe not quite as much. But for games, I feel it. and oftentimes that's where animators will come in, right? You see this a lot with fighting games. Animators will come in and use the work based off of the motion capture data and kind of augment it where they need to make it to animate it, to make it really feel animated, and because the rules of animation are there because a one-to-one recreation of life is not actually the most lifelike feeling. It's not actually the most lively feeling. So the way the characters look and the way they move always feels like it's in a bit of a tonal clash with what's happening. Alan specifically has this weird kind of dumb look on his face all the time. Just the way that his eyes are, he's modeled with a very short upper lip. And his teeth are always showing. His top row of teeth are always showing. And I always find it very distracting in every scene. And it does kind of take me out of it a little bit. It does feel a little bit weird and a little bit janky looking. And it's the one way I would say the game is really brought down. The one way. Because the narrative is so strong. And it stands to contrast the strength of the narrative. If it was just a whatever story, then maybe it wouldn't be as big of a deal. But I noticed it a lot more. I don't know. Is there anything else that I'm not thinking of? I'm very hungry, so my brain isn't working quite as well. Oh, right. This might be the last thing, but Alan Wake comes from a very interesting time, which I feel like was actually most of video games, that has ended recently. And I'm not sure when exactly it ended, and I would love to kind of trace it back a bit. It's a time of product placement. Now, I mentioned, Alan Wake's flashlight. Literally, I feel like it's one of the most iconic parts of the game, one of the most iconic visuals. It's almost inseparable from him as a character. I mentioned I was playing Alan Wake to someone the other day, and they said, "Oh, the guy with the flashlight." That's who he is to many people who didn't even play the game. That person hadn't even played the game. And this flashlight, your primary tool, your weapon, the one weapon you have to fight back against the forces of darkness that are threatening to overtake the world. It runs on 100% Energizer batteries, baby. Energizer batteries, let's go. It is so funny to be walking around this game and just picking up Energizer brand battery packs. Like the exact packs you could pick up in a store. Maybe they've changed their branding since, but the exact same look just really threw me off at first. I forgot about the product placement in this game. Also, his phone, Verizon Wireless, because even in the Nightmare Shadow world, Verizon's got you covered. Just hilarious. It doesn't really take away from the game, not for me at least. Maybe for some people it would be distracting. It's just really funny. It's just a really funny... I don't know when... I feel like product placement has almost just gone the way of the dodo. I'm trying to think of other recent examples. And all I can think of is like the Red Bull logo costumes in Street Fighter V, which were literally just... Wait, was that Red Bull or was that just like the Capcom Pro Tour? They would just like stick the logo onto the characters' designs. It looked stupid. It looked terrible. What other product placement? Oh, I mean, I guess Final Fantasy 15 with the ramen. Oh no, I'm thinking about ramen now. Oh, I'm hungry. It felt like at one point in time, Yakuza's probably got something. It felt like at one point in time, product placement was so common, even outside of things where, you know, like sports games you kind of expect. Like, people kind of give it the pass in sports games because, you know, you watch NASCAR, they're literally covered in sponsorships, right? Football clubs, they've got sponsorships all over. Arenas and stadiums have sponsorships all over. It's kind of just part of what people expect now. So people sort of give it the pass. But I mean, there was, Jesus. I'm trying to think of other, hang on. Again, brain's not working that great. Product placement in games. Yeah, let's look up, is there anything funny? Product placement in video games. Oh shit, what am I talking about? The Norman Reedus Monster Energy. I guess that's a recent one. Kit Kats were in Theme Hospital. Fuck, I want Kit Kats now. Fuck! Oh yeah, Enter the Matrix has Powerade machines. Mercedes-Benz in Mario Kart 8. Cup noodles in Final Fantasy 15. I'm trying to think like recent stuff. Yeah, the Monster Energy thing. What the fuck is Judge Dredd versus Death? 2005? Yeah. Am I crazy, or was product placement more common back then? Like in the 2000s, right? Am I crazy? I want to make a video on this. This seems like a fun video idea. But yeah, it feels uncommon enough that it threw me for a loop when I first saw it, and then remembered, oh yeah, this game had product placement in it. Like literally the last episode of the game is like, it's like the climax, and it feels, there's so much momentum. I was so hyped for it. It starts with you getting into a car to drive to the final destination. And it's like you've come all this way, and now you're in a car and you feel really empowered now because you just get to cross so much distance. And it feels really good. And it starts with what else? What else? 2 back-to-back billboards for Energizer and Verizon, baby. It's so fun. It's like in the parking lot. I think you're facing the Verizon ad. It's hilarious. Yeah. The on the topic of that, the game, I would say, okay, the one weakness of the game, the ending is a little weak. It does end on, it's like a cliffhanger. It's pretty much a cliffhanger. It's like a stinger for a sequel, which American Nightmare kind of is, from what I understand. I read like a quick synopsis, or just the premise after I finished the first game. Yeah, it also doesn't feel the most developed. I like the sections of you just like driving and driving and driving, but it felt like they got to episode 6 and they were like, okay, well, how do we, there's only like 2 things that happen. Really one section that happens. How do we turn that into something? How do we turn that into a whole episode, into like an hour and a half to 2 hours? And the way that they do it is fine. It feels a little bit padded, which unfortunately leads up to an ending which isn't entirely satisfying. The ending feels a little bit rushed. I really wanted to see what happened to more of the characters afterwards, like my man Barry. I'm assuming everyone was fine, but yeah, left me a little bit dissatisfied. Although, like, the end section is cool, if, again, a little short, and I think that they could have done, I don't want to spoil it because I am recommending it. I think they could have done a little bit more with the concept at the tail end of the game. You'll see. It's the stuff they do with words. It's really neat, but not a whole lot is done with it that's very meaningful, which is unfortunate. So, slightly undercooked ending, but really good game overall. Oh, I should mention, this game has a very interesting development history. It started off as like an open world game because they were really trying to differentiate it from Max Payne. And then eventually they were just spinning their wheels for so long and didn't have a coherent vision that they just came in, they tore it down, and they were like, okay, they didn't restart from scratch. But they restructured the game from scratch, and they essentially took as to be as economical as possible, take as much stuff that they could that they had already finished and try to work it into the new idea for the game, which was a much more linear experience. And I think it really benefits. It benefits and it hurt, and it in some ways you can really tell in a good way sometimes. For one is that all of the locations take place in literally the same map. They had built this whole open world and this rendering technology to actually draw all that stuff in the distance. And you'll be walking around in the woods and you'll get to a certain vantage point and you will see off in the distance, hey, that's the gas station from episode 1. Cool. You don't go there. You're not going to go there, but you can see it. And it's like, oh, this is all part of the whole world. The world feels very cohesive, which is nice. It feels like everywhere you're going fits in some kind of a way. You never feel like you're just being dropped into like a separate dimension for an episode. But there are ways in which you can really tell, like just big areas of space that you can run around in that don't have a lot of stuff, that are just kind of there because they designed it. I feel like at least half of every gameplay section starts with, or it is preceded by a cutscene of Alan dropping into the woods or running into the woods. And then you can feel some designer saying, we made this whole map. You're going to fucking run through it. You spend so much time in the woods. Yeah, there's like one part where you go a little bit underground into a cave. It's a big cave with all these different tunnels and routes, and you go down one, and the game literally, like, Alan keels over in a migraine, and the game forces you to turn around, and is like, I can't go that way. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's part of the map that they never bothered to seal off, that was gonna go somewhere else when this was an open world game. That stuff they never finished. Yeah, you can feel it. But again, it creates for a cool feeling of the world, everything fitting together. You know, you'll be standing somewhere in one spot in one episode, and then a few episodes later, you'll be looking down and seeing the exact same place you were looking up from. And it's neat. It's neat. It lends a sense of atmosphere, and like Bright Falls is a real place. It's good. Yeah. Anything else to say about Alan Wake? Not really. I want to play the next one. I want to play American Nightmare, because apparently it's pretty short. And maybe I'll play Control, and maybe I'll play Alan Wake 2 if they'd ever... I don't want to download the Epic Game Store. I don't want to download the Epic Game Store. I don't want to use it. I don't want to give Tim Sweeney the satisfaction.